Hey there folks, Graham here, aka Splooty and the Death Ray, and welcome to the channel. Today I'm going to be taking you on a whistle-stop tour around my home studio. I see a lot of YouTube videos reviewing gear, so I thought I'd give you a little insight into the gear I have in my studio. So without further ado, let's roll titles and dive straight in. So, welcome back and welcome to my studio, or spare bedroom, as you may be able to see. So what I'm going to do now is just give you a quick little whistle-stop tour through my studio gear. I'll start with what's in camera at the moment and then open to a slightly wider shot. So behind me I have a Seaboard Rise 49 from Roland. This is a multi-polyphonic expression MIDI keyboard, which I've got linked up to the Equator 2 software, and I pretty much use those on a one-for-one basis as they're paired together perfectly, and that's what they were designed for. Beneath that I've got the Arturia Matrix Brute, which is a monophonic analog synth, but also does paraphonic, so you can play up to a 3-note chord, each note being one of the oscillators. So it's not polyphonic but paraphonic, where each note is a separate oscillator. Below that I have the Behringer audio interface. This is a UMC 404 HD, so it has 4 inputs on the front. I use the first 2 inputs for my mixer that all the hardware synths run into. The third input I have my microphone and vocal effects unit running into, and the fourth unit is for my guitar up on the wall, so that I have all of those slots available. Next to that I've got a little Roland Go mixer. This is something I picked up a few years ago when I was first making some short little videos. You can plug keyboards, guitars, etc. into it and then plug it straight into your iPhone and record your audio straight into the phone on which you are shooting the footage. Below that I have a Behringer Neutron, which is a standalone analog synthesizer. I've actually got this paired up with the Matrix Brute via MIDI cables, so I can use the keyboard with its aftertouch etc. from the Matrix Brute. Also gives me the advantage that I can use the sequencer from the Matrix Brute to drive that. I've also got that connected to another synthesizer, which I'll talk about in a second. Over on the left, I've got a Behringer DeepMind 12, another analog synthesizer, part digital. It's got a huge array of effects within here, which are all digital, but the overall signal path is analog, and it is therefore a true analog synth. Below that I have a Nectar Impact LX88 Plus MIDI keyboard. This I have linked up and synchronized to control various VSTs that I've got loaded into Cubase, which is the DAW that I use. Now I'll just open up to a wider shot to show you the rest of the studio. So moving over to the other side of the studio, I've got a whole suite of the IRA Roland Gear. So we've got the Roland System 1 4-voice polyphonic synthesizer, which can also be played monophonically, but it also has a plug out ability where I can put other synthesizers, or virtual synthesizers can be loaded into this, and then without connecting to the computer you can play them. They're stored in here, so you can play VSTs almost like hardware. So not only has it got the System 1 engine, I've also got the SH101, SH2 and the ProMars synthesizers, which I can use within here if I load them in. I've got the TR8 drum machine, which was Roland's first take on a recreation of the 808. I know there's been another iteration since, but got this one quite a few years ago. I believe it's now been superseded by the TR8S. I've got the TB3, which again was their first recreation of the old 303 bassline machine, which many people will be familiar with from the acid house scene, late 80s, early 90s. We have an Arturia Keylab 61, so I use this linked up, a bit like the Nectar. This is linked up and synchronized to various VSTs, primarily the Arturia V collection, for which it maps perfectly. And then below that I have a Korg MOX6 or MOX6, which I bought. This is one of my oldest synths. When I say old, about sort of 10 or 11 years old. 10 to 12 years old. This used to be the heart of my studio as a workstation. Huge number of voices, huge amount of capability. Also had its own audio interface built in, so I used to run everything through the audio interface in here. But as I've garnered more analog and standalone hardware, I needed a bigger audio interface, hence the Behringer that I showed earlier on. Then over at the back here, I've got a TC Helicon Voice Live Touch 2, which is a vocal effect unit, which if I go into here, for example, I can put a little bit of delay onto my voice. If I go into this Judas setting, I've got a slightly different, where I can turn effects on and off. And if I go back to the start, I'm now back on my standard voice setting that I use for narrating the videos. Coupled with the TC Helicon, I've got 3 different microphones that I use in my setup. I've got a Studio Electronics X1S condenser microphone. I do have the shield that goes around it with it. You can buy that as a kit. Over here I have an Electro Voice dynamic microphone. So the dynamic microphone I use primarily for live singing in the studio if I'm recording a live performance. The condenser microphone I use primarily for recording, for want of a better word, studio releases, things that I am going to release on Spotify, etc. It just gives a little bit better dynamics and a little bit better sort of subtlety, light and shade in the voice with the condenser microphone. I also then have, which I'm using at the moment, a Rode Wireless Go. So this is the transmitter, and on the other end here, if I pull this off and bring it over to the camera, I have another little transmitter here, which is connected through a wire up through my shirt to this lavalier microphone. I use this lavalier on a small headset because I find that as I move around the studio, my voice moves with the microphone. You can use them as a lapel mic, which is what most people do, but I tend to find as I move, if I'm doing things in the studio, my voice might dip in or out, and it creates a lot of fuss afterwards in terms of processing the audio. So I tend to stick with this headset. It also means I can go from, as I said earlier, from speaking to singing without having to change microphones, because this does quite well as a little microphone for singing. Then over here on the corner we have the Spark LE drum machine, which is linked up to the Spark drum software from Arturia. And then underneath the table I also have a Behringer FCB 1010 MIDI pedal board. Effectively this I use with the Squier Stratocaster that I have up on the wall. I tend to run the Squier Stratocaster through Cubase and use various virtual effects, VST Amp Rack in Cubase and Guitar Rig Pro from Native Instruments, and this pedal board is very good for controlling those VSTs. Effectively you can control wah-wah pedals, control volumes, the volumes of the amps, and you can switch between presets, etc. using this pedal board. So I shall just sling that one back under the desk. So effectively that's the main studio setup. I don't think I've missed anything. And just to give you a little insight into how all of that is hooked up, effectively what I've got, as I said earlier, is a combination of hardware and MIDI keyboards. We have analog hardware, digital hardware, and then MIDI keyboards. Now all of the hardware, which would be the DeepMind 12, the Matrix Brute, the Behringer Neutron, the Roland Gear and the MOX6 all feed into the mixer, which in turn feeds into the audio interface just underneath the Matrix Brute here. For all of them, the audio feeds directly into the mixer, apart from the neutron, which is running into the Yamaha MOX. And that's because the neutron doesn't have any real sort of effects built in, like reverb, etc. So I use the effects unit in here. The MOX has an audio input to allow you to put external instruments in and use the effects engine in that to affect that instrument, which is what I do with the neutron. So they're all linked together in there. And then everything via MIDI cables. One last thing I do have is I have a little MIDI Solutions Quadra Through box, which is like a MIDI synchronization box. And the Matrix Brute, the DeepMind, the Ira Gear, all the hardware is linked through that MIDI box effectively to the TR8 drum machine. So I use that, for want of a better word, as my master clock. If I change the dial on the TR8, if I change the tempo, all of the associated hardware will match the tempo of that drum machine. All I then have to do is set the same tempo in Cubase, and all my MIDI keyboards will also run at the same tempo effectively. So the hardware goes through the mixer, all goes into the audio interface. The TC Helicon, with the whatever microphone I have attached, goes straight into the audio interface. The guitar goes straight into the audio interface. And then I also use effects within the DAW. So the audio signal coming through from the guitar, I use Guitar Rig 6 and VST Amp Rack for various effects on there. The Nectar Impact LX88, I effectively have this set up within my DAW and with the VSTs, so this is all synchronized to my suite of Spectrasonics VSTs, so Omnisphere, Trillion, Stylus RMX and Keyscape. So I use the drum pads and things up here for Stylus RMX. You can also play using the keyboard. But all the other virtual instruments are mapped to here along with the faders and the knobs. And then the Keylab over here is linked up to the Arturia V collection. I think I'm on V collection 6. They're probably up to about V collection 8 or 9 now. But this works very well. It's designed obviously to work with the Arturia V collection. All the knobs and sliders map automatically to what you see on screen with the V collection, and so it works quite seamlessly. And then the Seaboard Rise at the back, that is solely linked to the Equator 2 software from Roland, which goes in partnership with the keyboard. You can use the Seaboard to operate other VSTs, but I tend to use it solely with the Equator. So effectively I've sort of got each keyboard for one thing. So when I've got the whole studio set up, I'm not messing around with swapping between VSTs on various synths, etc. I can set them all up how I want them and then jam live in the studio. So that's my studio. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please feel free to subscribe and follow and ring that bell so you'll be notified of any new videos as and when I post them. What I do aim to be doing is doing a review of all of this gear that I have in my studio throughout the next 12 months, making individual videos on each piece of equipment. As I know there is an interest in this equipment, whether it be a new purchase or whether people be purchasing second hand. They're always on the look for reviews of equipment and what people think of them. So as I say, if you've enjoyed this, please feel free to follow and subscribe, and I hope to see you again here on Splooty Vision in the future. For now, goodbye.